Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Science Behind Your Crime, and I'm your host, Gianna Newberry. So, today we're going to get into a really interesting topic that I went over in my Inquiry to Science and Math class, but before we get into that, I wanted to talk about a way that chemistry could possibly be used and related to forensics. So, in the past week, during my chemistry lab, we were doing acid-base titrations, and it got me thinking, I wonder if there's such a way of using titrations in forensics. And so I did do some research, and I didn't find a whole lot, nothing that went into detail, but it got me thinking, could a titration be used in toxicology? And let's propose this hypothetical scenario. Let's say there was a victim that overdosed on a certain drug or medication, and we wanted to find the concentration of that drug or medication, and we could use an acid-base titration. And of course, we would need some kind of indicator to see if this unknown substance is acidic or basic, and that's what would allow us to do the titration to begin with. But this is interesting because, let's say a suspect or some kind of person of interest were to have possession of a drug of this concentration, it could indicate some kind of connection, especially if the concentration is not common or the drug itself is not common, and then on top of that, it's the same concentration. I don't know. It's really cool stuff. Even though I wasn't able to find a lot of information on it, it's an interesting concept, and I'm definitely going to be doing more research on that. Okay, so now moving on to the thing that really interested me in my class, that was handwriting analysis. And it's so crazy to think that even handwriting has, personality that's unique to you. Everyone's handwriting is different. I mean, yes, of course, there may be similarities with my handwriting and someone else's, but at the end of the day, we have our little touches, those little details that make the writing unique to us. So I struggled a lot with this assignment initially because it's pretty tedious. You really have to take your time and look at each individual letter, and then the words, and then the spacing between the letters, and then the spacing between the words, the proportion of everything, and it's just a lot to look for, and you have to be patient with it. Even the letters in the beginning of a sentence may differ from the same exact letters at the end of a sentence, like A's. There may be little slight differences, and there's just, a lot of things to look for. So it was difficult for me because I don't have a lot of patience, and that's really what it requires, patience and being really thorough. So in my assignment, we analyzed this unknown writing sample and then the samples of 5 suspects, and we had to match them to determine which of the suspects was more likely to have had written the note. So handwriting analysis on its own would probably not lead to any kind of arrest or even be enough evidence in the courtroom, but it's so fascinating because it can definitely shift the focus. And what I mean by that is that if you match the handwriting of a note, let's say found at a crime scene, to a suspect that you have, then that suspect is going to be looked into further. So I would say that handwriting analysis is something that can facilitate the solving of a crime. So now getting into the famous case that we're going to talk about today. This case does involve handwriting analysis, and we will be talking about the BTK serial killer. And I just want to preface this by saying we're going to be talking about some really disturbing things. Once again, nothing too graphic, but there will be mention of torture, murder, and things of a sexual nature, so listener discretion is advised. Now, if you're not familiar with the BTK Killer, BTK stands for Bind, Torture, and Kill. And this all started on Tuesday, January 15th of 1974, when Joseph Otero, who was 38 years old, his wife, Julie, 34 years old, and their 2 kids, Joseph, who was 9 years old, and Josephine, who was 11 years old, were all found dead in their home in Wichita, Kansas. The perpetrator had actually made the children watch as he strangled their parents to death. Then he proceeded to kill the son and later the daughter. Josephine, the daughter, was dragged into the basement and hung from a sewer pipe. and the killer did take a souvenir, her underwear, which is very disturbing. About 3 months later, on April 4th, Catherine Bryant, who was 21 years old, was killed in her home, and the perpetrator had actually broken into the house and was confronted by Catherine's brother, Kevin. Thankfully, Kevin escaped with gunshot wounds, but unfortunately, Catherine was stabbed multiple times and died as a result. Later on, the perpetrator had written a letter that said, quote, "Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity. The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You see, he added again, they will be on the next victim." End quote. Now, this letter did have some grammatical errors, but that's the way that it was written. And it was basically just throwing a jab at the people who had claimed to have been involved in the crimes that were not. What's interesting is that the perpetrator never actually gave this letter to police. He left it in a book at a public library and called Wichita Eagle to tell them of the letter's location. The next murder didn't happen until March 17th of 1977 when Shirley Vian, or Vian, I'm not exactly sure how her last name is pronounced. She was 24 years old and was killed in her home. Shirley was sexually assaulted, and unfortunately her children witnessed the assault, but they later escaped the killer. The perpetrator composed a poem titled Shirley Locks, and just a small part of it reads, quote, Shirley Locks, thou shalt not scream, but lay on cushion and think of me and death, end quote. Later that year, on December 8th, Nancy Jo Fox, who was 25 years old, was killed in her home after her children were locked in the bathroom. The perpetrator then called police to inform them of this murder, and later it was discovered that a payphone was used. This phone call was actually taped, and I'll link a video of the audio down below. But the person who called the police had said, "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing, Nancy Fox," end quote. Although the next murder didn't occur until about 8 years later, in 1978, the killer sent a package containing some really bizarre contents, including a poem he had written titled, "Oh, That's Nancy," referring to his last victim, Nancy Jo Fox. On April 27th of 1985, Maureen Wallace Hedge was choked to death by the perpetrator, and she was only 53 years old. The perpetrator had then gotten upset because the media wouldn't credit him for the crimes, and so he actually wrote a letter to a local TV station saying, quote, "How many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention?" End quote. He even listed a few possible nicknames that he could be referred to as, one of which being the BTK Strangler. On September 16th of 1986, BTK killed Vicky Lynn Weigirl. I'm not sure how that last name is pronounced once again, so forgive me. She was in her home when she was killed, and her 2-year-old child witnessed. Initially, the police pinned this crime on Vicky's husband, but after further investigation, it was found to have been the BTK killer. On January 19th of 1991, the last known victim of BTK was 62-year-old Dolores Earlene Johnson Davis. Her body was found at West 107th Street, North and North Meridian Street in Park City. Over a decade had passed since the last killing, but BTK was still upset because the police and media stopped talking about him. He wanted attention and he wanted the people to talk about him, so in an effort to keep his reputation alive, he started sending packages containing evidence from his crime scenes to the police. What ultimately gave him up was a document's metadata contained in a floppy disk. Now, this is actually kind of funny because the BTK killer had sent a letter to police asking if he could be traced by a letter he wanted to send over using a floppy disk, and the police replied saying they couldn't. So BTK sent the floppy disk to police, but he didn't clean it up thoroughly enough. And inside of it, police found the metadata of a deleted Microsoft Word document. This document was traced to Christ Lutheran Church, as the council president authored it. And the council president, Dennis Rader. After he was tracked, police were able to forensically match a series of these handwritten letters to Dennis Rader. These letters, of course, had been sent to police to gain attention, to keep the name of BTK alive, but they were also used to strike fear into the public. DNA samples from Dennis Rader's daughter were even later used to compare the crime scene DNA, and it was all a match. Now, I tried to find pictures of some of these handwritten letters from BTK before his identity was known, but unfortunately, I couldn't find any. It is important to note, though, that the handwriting analysis alone would not have been enough to put Dennis Rader away, and it especially would not have been held up in court. But added to the other evidence, such as the metadata contained in that floppy disk, the DNA in the crime scenes, the case against Rader was strong. On June 27th of 2005, Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 175 years in jail without parole. Although he has only 10 confirmed victims, it is estimated that the number is actually higher, but for now, only 10 are known to be for sure. Okay, so that was the BTK case. It was really heavy stuff. Linked down below is the website with all of the victims' names, and I just want to emphasize the importance of being respectful to these victims and their families. So that concludes this episode. I hope you guys found it to be insightful and interesting. Thank you guys for joining in, and I hope to see you on the next episode of The Science Behind the Crime.